Good morning, everyone. We're going to just give folks a couple more minutes to get logged in here. Hope everybody's doing well, had a nice holiday weekend. As we're waiting for folks to log in, just remind you that as you come into the GoToWebinar, you're in the listen-only mode. You're automatically muted. You can change the functionality if you're having technical difficulties with your computer or your phone. You can switch back and forth between the two during the presentation with no interruption. We do have a space to type questions. Feel free to type those through Randy's presentation, but we will do a Q&A at the end. If there's a really relevant question, I may kind of pause Randy and ask that question if it makes sense, but most of the time we keep these for the end. But type them in as we go through. There's a question box. Be sure and type those in there and I'll moderate the questions at the end. If for some reason we can't get through all the questions, and typically we've been able to do that with our presenters, but if you have any questions or need follow-up information, there's my email address there on the screen. I do also want to mention Randy sent a resource document yesterday to me as well as with his presentation, and so that is in the handout section. So you already have access to that. So everything he talks about, he's already got links and additional information in that resource page. So Gayla, I think we're ready to get going.
All right, great. Good morning, everybody. First of all, I really want to thank Randy for doing this, coming in this morning in Missouri and talking to our people here in Missouri. And I hope there's others out there that are just Missourians, but the love of Main Street, and they've joined us this morning. But as many as you all know, Randy has worked in many of our communities in Missouri, and we hope to have him in many, many more. He's always, Randy, when I talked last week during our webinar, kickoff talking about who was coming up next week, I told him, I said, we have to always let Randy go last because he's always the one that steals the show. So he's the one that has, you know, all the creative, beautiful, sexy pictures we talk about. And so we always have to have him come towards the end because, again, you steal the show. And so, but before we get started, because I know sometimes some of you guys have to get off a little bit early, we do want to talk about next week's webinar. Next week's webinar will focus on rules of thumb to help recession pandemic proof your communities to develop more resilient places in the future. So it is really all about, you know, let's hope and pray that this does not reoccur, but setting our businesses up for success if it does. But also, you know, this is horrible, but other things happen in our communities as well that we have to be resilient for. So this will be a great session from Derek Lumsden, and Derek was going to be one of our speakers at our state conference, but he offered to do this with us next Wednesday. So we're excited that he'll be with us next Wednesday. And yes, this is a picture of Randy stealing the show and Marceline. He definitely did there. Thank you, Randy, and floor is all yours.
Well, I was going to say, Randy reminded me yesterday that while he is our favorite designer that comes and creates great visuals and great presentations in our communities, we haven't had him at our state conference yet. And so we've got to get him on the list. He reminded me of that yesterday.
Well, Randy, again, as when you made your presentation last week and so many communities texted me and saying, we've got to have Randy. Believe me, they will tell me the same thing about state conference.
Cool.
Thank you.
Are you ready for me to take over, Keith?
Randy, I'm turning over the presentation to you, so it should be in your hands.
All right, one second. Oh boy. Okay,
There we go.
Okay.
All
well,
right.
Good morning. Yep. Is everything showing up okay on your end, Keith?
You're ready to go, Randy. Floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to address Missouri Main Street, and especially for those I've had the privilege of meeting before during my travels and work in Missouri. Thank you for joining us today. It's good to see you again. And for those I haven't, I hope to meet you in person as soon as possible. I can sincerely say I've thoroughly enjoyed all of my working experience in Missouri. You have a beautiful state, and you have great people, and I truly mean that. So I guess where I want to start is just to kind of give you the genesis of this presentation, because I think it's somewhat important. Mary Helmer of Main Street, Alabama, ironically, hired me over 6 months ago to create a presentation entitled Design in the Context of Disaster, based on the experience that myself and my team mates have had primarily on the Mississippi Gulf Coast after Hurricane Katrina, and then in Vermont after Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Sandy. And because Alabama had just experienced some unfortunate tornadoes, she felt like addressing this topic from the standpoint of how do we both recover from a disaster and then how to prepare ourselves to be more resilient would be appropriate. Little did we know, shockingly, that she could be that possibly prophetic, because at that time we didn't even have words in our vocabulary such as coronavirus, COVID-19, sheltering in place, flattening the curve, social distancing. Those terms were not even in our vocabulary. And so you can imagine our surprise when she called me up about a month ago and said, hey, all the stuff you did in Mississippi and Vermont is valid, but we have got to address COVID. And so it basically meant scrapping that entire presentation, starting all over again, which ultimately I think was a really wise and good stroke of good fortune, because it forced me to study some things that I really weren't on my radar screen at the moment. But there's something very important I need to say about that as we open up, and I'm going to feature hey, Keith, for some reason, I can't manipulate my slides. So I don't know what's going on. Oh, there it is. It just happened. Okay. So this was a quote by a fellow planner last week at the Unconference. And he says, there is no pandemic playbook. You're writing it today. And that's what you have to understand, the humility in which I submit these various design recommendations today. Man, we are literally just using our best guess and effort and professional judgment. But I'm not about to sit here and say these are the right or the right things or the right ways or the only ways, because I have no idea. I really don't. I was encouraged by the fact that Jonathan, a fellow planner out of Boston, said many of the same things I did. And so it gave me some assurance that I told Keith yesterday, even though we're all shooting at a moving target, it gave me a little bit of confidence that but the good news is I think we are shooting at the right target. And so just what I'm trying to say here is I am not an expert. You've got people on your own board like Dr. Stephen Hoffman who are 10 times smarter than me, but the best designer on the planet still only has less than 3 months exposure, no pun intended, to these issues. And so I don't position myself as an expert. I doubt he or anyone else does either. We're just offering our best judgment. And the final thing I'll say before we jump in is obviously we're all going to have to test every one of these recommendations against our own situation. What is allowed and permissible in South Carolina may not even be allowed or permissible in Missouri. And each of your municipalities are kind of weighing in on when are we going to reopen and how are we going to reopen. And so you're going to have to test any and all these recommendations kind of against your local criteria. That being said, based on our work in Mississippi and Vermont, we uncovered, for lack of a better word, a number of best practices for design in the context of disaster. 3 of those, I think, also have some commonality with dealing with COVID. And so today's presentation, I'm going to deal with those 3 best practices, and I'm going to add a 4th to address COVID-specific issues that we heretofore really have been having addressed. And so the first recommendation for all of us, in particular Main Street programs and Main Street design committees, is that we need to kind of humble ourselves and map our skills against the needs of any of our communities that are in crisis. And one of the simplest ways you can determine how to map your skills to those needs is to ask this question: what are Main Street designers and design committees typically good at or capable of? Because the reason that question is so important is if you can't go into your community and articulate what you can do, how it can meet a tangible felt need, and recommend timelines and solutions, I'm just going to be blunt, we really aren't going to be of much help in the context of a disaster. So we have to be sure that when we insert ourselves into this pandemic from a design perspective, we should only promise things that we feel reasonably sure we can deliver on, because the last thing people in crisis need is to be further disappointed. And so the answer to this question, I think, helps us frame what we can probably respond with that's also going to meet a felt need. And so in my estimation, there are at least two, there's a lot more, by the way, but I think there's two things that Main Street designers and design committees typically are good at. One of those is graphic communication, and particularly when it comes to graphic design, signage, and space planning. And so if you, I didn't mean to go ahead to that slide. If you don't believe me about the importance of graphic communication, that I would show this as Exhibit A about the importance of graphic design, because in my humble estimation, this graphic, the flattening the curve graphic in whatever form you saw it in, to me, this changed the entire tenor of the conversation about COVID in America. Because before this diagram was released and explained, I think the general posture of the American public and populace was, we're going to hoard, and we're going to hide, and we're going to try to avoid getting this virus. And then when we really understood what was really at stake, it's like, guys, you're probably going to get exposed to this. That's not the issue. The issue is, how do we manage it? Then it changed it from this hoarding, hiding methodology to everybody working together to manage it for the purpose of the overall common good. And so with this as sort of a Exhibit A of the importance of diagrams and physical graphic communication, what kinds of graphic communication can and should Main Street be involved in? And the first one I would say is in what I would call transactional directional signage. My assumption at this point is you, like me, on a regular basis, if you're going to get food or goods right now, you are probably encountering signage like this that's going to be directing you as to how you're going to attain food from your favorite restaurant. Are you going to park here, or are you going to drive through? Are you going to open the door or open the window? Are you going to get out of the car? Is it going to be handheld payment or contactless payment? And all of those decisions are being done in a manner different than the way we used to do them. And so we're at the mercy of the directional transactional signage that our merchants and restaurateurs are putting forth for us. Therefore, and thusly, because everyone's doing their own thing, there's a wide range of both clarity and quality when it comes to that signage. And here's my point in that. Speaking from my own experience, I remember getting Mediterranean food the other day, and the process was clear, it was understandable, it was easy. Conversely, I went to get pizza, and I didn't know what to do. It was confusing, and it left me feeling nervous and uncomfortable, because I didn't know did I park at the right place? Was I supposed to call? Was I supposed to go in? Was I supposed to wait? And here's my point. We Main Street people, we tend to be a lot more forgiving of those kinds of experiences from our local restaurateurs and retailers. But that may not be true of other non-Main Streeter kind of customers. And I would rue the day, and I would grieve that a bad transactional experience would prevent people from coming back to frequent our merchants and restaurateurs and retailers on a frequent basis. And so one recommendation I would make is, with a sense of humility, for the purpose of helping, I would encourage your Main Street, and especially your design committees, to conduct sign audits on behalf of your program restaurateurs and merchants, and suggest ways that process may be clarified or improved. And especially if and I'm going to go ahead and foreshadow a recommendation in a moment, you have facade grant funds that could be diverted to help even supply some signage that would ramp up the quality of that signage. And so here's some examples of that. You know, imagine the difference between some of the hand-painted signs that you saw on the previous page and these custom designed transactional directional signs that Ben Muldrow made for Southwest Virginia Main Street programs. It just ramps up the caliber and the quality, in addition to providing clarity for the transaction experience. I clearly remember on the Mississippi Gulf Coast that coming out of a disaster, you know, one of the key questions is, when you see a closed sign on a business, you're always asking the question, are they closed for the day or are they closed for good? And so it's not enough anymore to just have an open sign. There needs to be, we're still open in the midst of this crisis. And so again, helping with that kind of signage, especially if you want to brand it, is very important for our businesses right now, because everyone is staggering their openings, and they have a lot of different you know, criteria by which they can do it, whether it's, you know, how they're handling the interiors and the exteriors. But signage is critical to make sure our customers know they're welcome to come back and there's still something for them to do. I love what Arkansas Main Street did on behalf of all of their Main Street communities. They basically submitted kind of a high level, all of our downtowns are still open kind of messaging. And I love the tone, because I think we all can respect the fact that what's making this time tough is we've got to simultaneously provide for safety and health and care, but we also need to tell this message that we're open. And how do we balance those two messages? And so just focus on the two taglines of these two. I love it on the top left, Main Street Arkansas family, because family is always open. And then at the bottom, when you feel comfortable, come find shelter in a place that feels like home. So these ads are playing on these terms that are resonating with us and have become a part of our common vocabulary right now about sheltering in place and home and open and closed. And so, you know, you may want to consider, you know, a campaign such as this. I think a third category of graphic communication, especially when it comes to signage, pardon me, would be the safety graphics, because I think by this point we've all either seen really tastefully done kind of caution signs, and we've also seen those really scary ones that made us want to stay home and never go out again. And then another good example is the whole social distancing 6 foot apart for safety. And some of these aren't necessarily bad, and they probably all get the job done, but imagine the power if your Main Street program did what this one did in Arkansas, and they not only ramped up the quality of the sticker to make it look attractive, but they also received some brand equity by virtue of the messaging that pertains to Arkansas's Main Street programs. All right, so that talks about graphic communication from the standpoint of graphic design. But I think another thing that our Main Street designers and design committees tend to be good at is diagramming space layouts and things of that nature. You know, one of the things that we may want to offer is especially to our retailers, is how can we create merchandising layouts that simultaneously satisfy our safety, social distancing requirements, but maximize the viewing of their respective merchandise and inventory. And in a similar fashion, you know, how can we come along our restaurateurs to help them with space layouts in the interior of their restaurants that could maximize their seating, again, while satisfying the social distancing safety recommendations. I think going forward, I'm going to talk about this now and once again later in the presentation. You know, another thing that we're good at as designers and design committees is just sketches to help people visualize certain things. And I think in this current reopening phase, one of the things that we need to help our restaurateurs with is how can we artificially create added seating capacity, since so much of their capacity has been diminished, you know, by both interior as well as exterior social distancing seating layout requirements. And one of the ways we can do this, of course, is through the use of either parklets or pedlets. In case you aren't, I think most people are aware of what a parklet means, but just by way of simple explanation, it's when you create a platform that occupies one or perhaps two parking spaces to create kind of a pop-up park, but in this case with restaurants, it would include seating opportunities. A pedlet kind of turns that same concept and it just inverts it. In other words, you allow the outdoor seating to occur on the sidewalk beside the restaurant. And so where you can no longer walk on the sidewalk, you divert that walking path out into the parking lot, like the image you see on the bottom. Now, there are a lot of great resources, and this is the beauty of this. If your community decides to pursue the parklet or the pedlet solution to helping give your restaurateurs a fighting chance in this context, in the PDF that Keith attached, I supply you with links to every one of the parklet PDFs I'm about to describe. This one is from Anniston, has some really good information and layouts and dimensions. I'm going to come back to this one much later, but this is from the Tampa, Florida Lift Up Local Recovery Plan, where they both provide parklets as well as just seating in parking spaces without a platform solutions. But here's the two that I want to focus on for now. This one from San Marcos, Texas was featured recently in the National Main Street Center's blog, and for good reason. The most important word on that front page is the word temporary, because I think in a lot of our municipalities, they're hesitant to try some of these solutions because they think they're going to be permanent installations. And I think if we can just convey the argument that no, this is just a stopgap solution to give our restaurateurs a fighting chance at surviving against their reduced seating regulations, that's a really good message to convey. And so the San Marcos Parklet Manual both has that language, but it also has applications. So everything you sort of need to appeal to your municipalities is contained herein. And in a similar fashion, the Parklet Toolkit from UCLA, just for the record, from us Main Street designers' point of view, this is the Bible when it comes to parklets. There is no better one source of information about parklets, their purpose, their designs, than this one that we're aware of, and they give it away free of charge, shockingly. And again, every one of these that I've shown you, if you just click on the appropriate link in the PDF I've supplied, will take you right to it and you can download them. But the advantage of the UCLA is if you decide to pursue it, it's going to give you language for terminology. It's going to give you layouts. I love the fact that in their design guidance section, they even give solutions in situations where at the bottom right, it's easy to think about a parklet in a parallel parking space. How do you do it in angled parking? Well, they give you solutions to that as well. They even give you free of charge construction details for benches on the top, planters on the right. They show how to structure these things and how to level these things. And a very important body of information on the bottom right pertains to signage, because one of the big issues you'll have to determine is, are these parklets going to be designed and installed and maintained by the private property owner or the restaurateur, or are they going to be public installations? Just for the record, either one have been used and either one can work. I would humbly submit that having the private person construct and maintain them is probably the better route, because there's probably going to be a higher standard of design creativity and a higher standard of maintenance and care, because if other people are in charge, then we all know what happens. But the point of the bottom slide is you need to sign them accordingly so that everybody understands the rules of behavior and ownership issues. A second thing that I believe Main Street designers and design committees tend to be good at or capable of is graphic visualization. And by this, I mean seeing the potential in our buildings, our alleys, our roadways, our streetscapes before others do, and communicating those ideas graphically. And again, if I've had the pleasure of working in your community, then there's probably a good chance, I prepared a before and after photo rendering, because it's just a simple way to convey for my wife and for many others. You know, I can look at this building, you can look at this building and see its potential with just, you know, removing inappropriate things and a new paint job, but most people can't. And so the power of doing a rendering like this is really helpful to motivate the private property owner so that they actually follow through and do the project. And so sometimes, you know, to quote the cliche, a picture really is worth 1,000 words. And so my admonition in this season of COVID would be these. First of all, I just want to commend Georgia Main Street. The Georgia Main Street program, for the foreseeable future, they are offering their facade design services at free of charge, just because they want to lower the bar in this time of COVID, when you know, reopening and the bottom line is on a lot of people's minds. They want to remove a financial barrier for even getting a design. Now, the only thing I want to add to the conversation from, I don't want to say this. I definitely think providing free facade design services is good. And I think providing just our typical appropriate historic preservation based design approaches to the facade renovations should absolutely continue. But I do think there may be certain issues that are COVID specific that we designers may need to start considering as we do those facade designs. And here's some examples. Again, my assumption is your experience, like mine, is there's been this plethora of new makeshift walk-up windows to create, you know, contactless payment and receipt of goods with our downtown restaurants and retailers, especially restaurants. And so going forward, I think one of the things that we need to add to our arsenal of design recommendations is how can we unfold potentially walk-up windows in the context of historic storefront designs. Now, let me quickly back up just a little bit, because I made a statement and I want to qualify it. To reiterate something I said before, I have no idea if walk-up windows that are currently temporary solutions to COVID will become permanent design features in our buildings going forward. I just, no one, at least I can't predict that. But my strong hunch is it probably will. In a similar fashion, I think another thing would be roll-up doors and windows, and operable doors and windows. Gayla, maybe this will help your husband make even more money with this business. But the kinds of operable doors and windows for our restaurants that provide indoor-outdoor seating, but they look as good when they're closed as when they're open and being used. I just think for us Main Street designers, we're going to have to pay a lot more attention to some of these details going forward than perhaps we have heretofore. And of course, making assumptions again that every one of us have experienced the plexiglass safety shield at this point. And again, if these become just temporary, then like in the upper left, it's no big deal. They just go away when the crisis blows over. My strong hunch tells me these kinds of things might be written into our codes going forward. And if so, I think where Main Street can come to bear on this design issue is, what should they look like? You know, should they be rimless like the top right so that it kind of goes away? Should it be framed like the bottom right to kind of go with the surrounding decor? Or bottom left, should it be framed in wood if it needs to respond to a warmer, more historic interior? I think those are some of the design issues that I want us to pay attention to. I don't want us to just settle for just slapping up a piece of plastic. So the second, best practice that we've learned from our disaster recovery planning effort is while we've got to make major responses, don't underestimate the power of small things. I'm only going to hit two things, and the second thing in this point is probably the crescendo of my presentation that I want to draw your attention to. But this first one is also important, but I'm going to qualify it very carefully. I'm just making a guess that as we kind of reopen out of COVID, both our Main Street programs and especially our municipalities, we're probably going to have less disposable capital at their disposal to go for large public improvement projects in the short run. If that ends up being true, are there some simpler, less expensive gestures that we can install in our downtown environment to introduce vibrancy and color and activity and animation for a lot lower price point? And I believe they are. And by the way, again, if you've been in one of my resource teams in Missouri, I've probably made the recommendation for vibrancy amenities, because it is shocking to me the power and the impact of colorful flower planters or bistro tables and chairs and street furnishings. And especially in the context of a crisis, we need quick wins, and ideally we need quick, highly visual wins that kind of psychologically send out a message that we're on the road to recovery. It's just really, really important for human beings to have hope. In a related way, are these kinds of gestures that would provide interactivity and activity, especially those that can also accommodate social distancing, whether it's cornhole or bocce or giant jing or checkers. Now, there's a massively, massively, massively important caveat that I have to say right now. I think in the former, these kinds of gestures you can probably go ahead and do now, and I know some Main Street programs that are already providing some of these for restaurateurs to help them in this crisis. We'll get to them in a minute. But I think these kinds of gestures probably need to be held back for a while until we kind of relax, assuming we do, sanitation or sanitization issues, because you probably don't want to be handling cornhole handbags after someone who you think may have the virus. And so for these kinds of gestures, I think they're important, but I see them as being the second wave as we come out of this, when those sort of sanitization considerations are lightened. I would not recommend these initially in reopening. Same to this. These are miniature portable golf holes that we've created in Lake City in conjunction with our high school art department and our local VOTEC. And again, the advantage of these is you can space them in a way that satisfies social distancing, but you're creating this outdoor amenity that creates activity and animation in your downtown. Again, I would hold off on these until hand sanitization issues are resolved going forward, or you have somebody who can wipe down those kinds of things after each use. One final quick word on this. If you typically call the things I've just shown on my screen creative placemaking, please feel the freedom to continue to do that. I am talking about the exact same thing. It's just I choose to use the term vibrancy amenities because my fear is if someone is uninformed about what is required to authentically make a place in a holistic fashion, i.e. the Main Street approach to making place, then they would falsely assume that just throwing down cornhole that they've created a place. And we all know that that would fall short. Vibrancy amenities are just one tactic towards creating authentic place. And so that's why I choose to use that terminology, in case you're wondering. Okay, these are not traditional or technically vibrancy amenities, but they were just such good ideas. I needed to give them a shout out and recommend them to you. Probably the kids in your neighborhood, like mine, they're all holed up with their parents all day. They love getting outside and doing bear hunts in the neighborhood or doing chalk art. And so Plant City, Florida, they created branded bags of sidewalk chalk and gave it away to the parents. And I just thought that was a really nice strategic move. And in Batesville, Arkansas, when they noticed that certain locations, where there was a long queue outside with social distancing and people were waiting out in the elements, they just provided bags of popcorn to the people waiting. And I just thought that was a really nice gesture. So that was just there for fun and giggles. I made this appeal last week at the conference, and I'm going to make it again because I'm going to be honest with you. I understand if I was on your end receiving this webinar, the temptation, and by the way, I'm not judging you at all. The temptation to multitask is significant. You know, we can't not turn off email and texts, and so you know it's really easy right now to be clipping your toenails while you're listening to me. I totally get that, and I've done the same thing. So I'm going to make an appeal, and I'm going to tell you I am not crying wolf. Okay. If you can only pay attention and give me your undivided attention for 3 minutes, let it be the next 3 minutes, because in my humble estimation, this is the most important point and recommendation I'm going to make all morning long. In a lot of my work across America with Main Street communities, I'm making facade grant or incentive program recommendations. And in instances where the local municipality or Main Street program does not have a great deal of money to go towards facade grants, or the private property owners of those buildings don't have a high degree of capacity, then instead of recommending traditional overall building facade grants, which by the way are great instruments and they've been used successfully hundreds of thousands of times, but what they entail is creating a design for the entire building, hiring an architect, hiring a contractor, doing the work, and then after it's work, then you submit for reimbursement of a certain amount up to a limit from the municipality or the Main Street program. That can be intimidating for a lot of our people, and it requires a lot of money. In those instances, I'm recommending facade component grants. And the best analogy that I can use for a facade component grant is to date myself and to appeal to the classic game, Mr. Potato Head. Because Mr. Potato Head is really nothing more than a big blob of brown plastic potato. But when we stick the arms and the legs and the nose and the mustache and the sunglasses, those components of what give Mr. Potato Head is his uniqueness and his identity. And so I kind of want to draw a parallel. Our buildings are just the potato. And the components that we stick on our buildings to give them authenticity and uniqueness are the signs and the paint and the awnings and the storefronts and the doors and the windows. And so in the facade component grant approach, the Main Street program only offers one or at most two components per year, and it simplifies the decision-making process for the property owner. Do I need a new awning or not? It's a simple question and answer. Do I need a new sign or not? And so on the right side, you can see what we've done in South Carolina. Beaufort did an awning component grant project a couple years ago. Hartsville is currently doing a signage one, and years ago, Conway did a slipcover removal grant. All right, so I just, in 1 minute, told you everything about facade components, and now I want you to forget it, with the exception of the methodology. So if you want to continue doing facade grants in COVID, by all means do. If you want to introduce facade component grants like these for buildings during COVID, please do. However, I'm wondering if one of the ways that we can be maximally responsive to our property owners, our building owners, our restaurateurs, and our retailers right now is, what if in this next small window of time, the component grants that we offer are COVID responsive component grants, the things that almost every one of our restaurateurs and retailers need right now to satisfy current CDC requirements. By way of example, in the bottom in the middle, South Carolina has allowed our restaurants to reopen, again, accommodating social distancing, which has reduced their seating capacity by upwards of 50 to 75%. However, one of the requirements is every restaurant has to have a hand sanitizer station. In the upper left, one of the ways that we can avoid contacting, door handles is using the foot door pulls. Most of our merchants are needing plexiglass windows. We've already talked about the Still Open for Business sign. Ron Campbell in Oakland County, Michigan recommended if our pedestrians are having to queue in a long line on a hot sidewalk, what if we provided pedestrian comforts for them, such as misting stations or pop-up umbrellas? I've already talked about the importance, bottom left, of transactional directional signage. What if the Main Street program were to provide those sign panels to create a uniform look to our downtowns. I'm just saying, if you have a facade program, and especially if you have a facade component grant program right now, I just would humbly encourage your board to consider, should we divert those funds from more traditional components like signs, paint, awnings, to things that are, you know, tangibly and actively responsive to urgent current needs of our building owners in our downtown in the context of COVID. And by the way, and the other reason is frankly, these things are less expensive than these things. And so it's kind of a double bang for the buck. You will not only get a killer amount of goodwill by providing these things, because imagine if you're a restaurateur or retailer, if you remove these costs from their burden, then it's more money in their pocket to either rehire or bring back somebody from furlough, or to staff up, or to just frankly to stay in business. And so again, for the relative cost, I just want to strongly, you know, encourage us to consider this approach. And the other good thing is there's just, in addition to the funding source that you may already have through facade grants, just diverting those funds, the CARES Act funds can be used towards these kinds of purchases. So to me, this really is something that we need to strongly consider. The last thing I'll say, well, actually two more things I'll say about this. So a lot of people are already acting on this. In Pascagoula, Mississippi, in response to hearing this presentation, they went out and bought, you know, picnic tables and umbrellas and put them in a public location to add seating opportunities for their local restaurants. And then, man, Mary Helmer in Alabama made my whole year. When she heard the presentation, she said, I'm making a grant application right now to a certain foundation. And you can see what she's asked for on the left. She's basically creating a pilot program that up to a certain amount of businesses in a Main Street community, they would receive, you know, a website online sales platform. They would receive foot door pull openers. They would receive a branded graphics package, the plexiglass shield, a hand sanitizer station, and even, you know, technical services. And so to me, what Main Street Alabama is recommending, and I'm praying and hoping they get funded, is there would be bringing a response that's going to meet a tangible felt need. And again, I can't even imagine the amount of goodwill that's going to go forward to their Main Street program as a result. So that's, by the way, you can go back to multitasking now. Just kidding. The only last thing I'll say about this is, if these permanent necessities become, temporary necessities become permanent installations, then I would want us at that point to really consider design ethic. You know, we've got the Mister station up in the upper left, but you can see the photo that I've attached to it. You know, what if we got a unit that looked a little bit more like our vintage light poles? And when it comes to hand sanitizer stations, you know, should it be, you know, a more well-designed chrome and plastic one on the upper right, or the bottom, you know, this wood one that has both tissues, hand sanitizer, and gloves, and then a branded panel? Again, imagine, you know, your Main Street brand at the top of that, and the goodwill that you receive if you supplied this unit to your local restaurateur. Every one of the things you've just seen that I've shown, you know, the hand sanitizer stations, the door pulls, I've given you links to those from a purchase site on the PDF. So we're going to speed up now so I can keep us on time. But the third, but really important point is, to quote a former president, it's all about the economy, stupid. The most essential thing that we can do to help our downtowns is to help stimulate our economy as quickly as possible. When it comes to our restaurants, I think that the essential question we need to be asking and answering is, how can we give them a fighting chance? You know, when their seating capacity has been reduced upwards of 50 to 75%. And so I want to go back to the parklets again, but I just want to go a little bit more in detail. This is one of the, obviously this image does not satisfy social distancing. I'm not implying that it does. But this artificially creates outdoor dining space without our restaurants having to build. If there's only one PDF from my handout that you go look at, this is the one you need to go look at. And it's the City of Tampa's Lift Up Local Economic Recovery Plan. And the reason is, well, I'll get back to that in a second. But they've actually recommended outdoor dining occupying some, if not all, of certain streets and certain blocks in their downtown districts where there's a preponderance of restaurants and retailers. And I do want to read a quote. Actually, let me read it while I'm on this page, because it's made by the guy in the upper right, Jason Fernandez, who owns the restaurant, the Tequila Bar. Because I want you to listen to his gratitude as well as his desire to satisfy safety. He says, "I was very excited this afternoon when we were notified that we would be able to utilize 7th Avenue for additional seating," says Jason Fernandez, owner of Tequila's Taqueria and Tequila Bar. "We want to be busy, but by no means do I intend to break the rules put forth by our city. I appreciate the courtesy extended to us by Mayor Jane Castor," and listen to this, "to give us a fighting chance at survival. And I have no intention of letting her down and risking the health of my guests or my staff." And I think that's the way the public will respond. You know, right now, we all need to be in this for the common good and looking after each other. And I think that's what the City of Tampa recognized is, you know, if there's ever a time that we need to defer to our restaurateurs and retailers, it's now. And this simple PDF gives the pilot project, you know, parameters for sidewalk activation, for the parklets. And I love what they did here, which to me is a really important cue for our Main Street communities, is they weren't doing this citywide. They were just doing it in very targeted areas called business recovery zones. And to me, our Main Street districts should be the poster child of business recovery zones. And so this is the reason I implore you to download this PDF is if you need one document to go and appeal to your municipality for some of these temporary gestures, this is the best one because they've done it extremely well, but it's not over the top in terms of regulations. And so it makes for an easy ask on your end to your local municipalities. I want to go ahead and hopefully answer or address something that you probably are pondering, and that is, you know, everybody right now is competing for this 9-foot swath of parking space in front of the restaurants. The restaurants want them for parklets. Some restaurants want them for curbside pickup. So how are we going to resolve those conflicts? Here's some other solutions. If your town, and right now I'm thinking of Sikeston, Missouri, and they've got this robust alley system behind their buildings. Don't forget about your alleys and your sides of the buildings as additional potential outdoor dining options, especially if they happen to be well designed. By the way, this is from Fort Wayne, Indiana. If you have alleys, but they aren't that well designed, then the other option is simply to use them as the location for curbside pickup. In other words, instead of having restaurant patrons picking up food in the front of the building, have them picking up in the back of the building. And I hope that makes sense from two perspectives. That's where the food is actually prepared anyway. And this is from Dallas, Texas, this taco shop. In the midst of COVID, they kind of dressed up their alley so that the curbside pickup for picking up the tacos would be fun. They were piping in music. I mean, who doesn't want to pick up a taco from an alley with that kind of music going on, right? And then they painted up their door to make it very appealing. And so now the beauty for this taco shop is they have simultaneously solved the curbside pickup issue, and they can also, you know, build a parklet in front of their space. And so they've resolved it both. So that's one way to kind of crack that egg. Now, we also need to be thinking about our retailers. I know a lot's been said about restaurants, but our retailers are going to have struggles too in two ways. And we've already addressed one, and that is how can we arrange their merchandise to maximize viewability, but satisfy social distancing. The second one, and I think the harder one, the more important one, is this question that was articulated by Ben Muldrow. You know, what trends are we seeing to address shifting property values based off of decreased occupancy quantity? Now, let me translate that into common English like you and I would use. We're going to have a lot of large buildings that heretofore were rented by a single tenant retailer. And in many instances, some of those retailers aren't going to reopen. And so now we're going to have a property on the left with, and you and I all know about Main Street buildings that are very narrow and very long, and it's a lot of square footage. And the heart of Ben's question is, coming out of this, you're going to have a harder time getting a tenant to occupy the entire building. And here's the key: because of the deflated economy, you aren't going to be able to charge as much for that same space as you was before. So we've got to figure this out both for the property owner and for the retailer. And one solution would be the creation of a demising wall grant, or encouraging demising walls to subdivide these bigger spaces, especially in situations where the large space is occupied by a professional office as opposed to a restaurant or retailer, because the unintended negative consequence of a professional space occupying the space adjacent to the sidewalk is it deadens the space. We don't have that sort of street frontage that's active. This shows an illustration from Paris, Arkansas. The building on the far right with the black awning was a Christmas decoration, Christmas gift shop, one of those shops that sells Christmas decorations year round. But they also own the building right in the middle, and they were using it completely for storage. And I know there's no building in Missouri where they're using the complete building for storage on the first floor, but they were here. And so the nice thing is she was a very astute businesswoman, as well as a diehard Main Street patron who wanted to do the right thing. And so we recommended, hey, what if we erected a wall? You pick your number, 15, 20 feet from the front storefront, and you keep all of your storage behind there. But in front, we can put these two active retail uses, or one retail uses. Because in my estimation, the answer to Ben's question is, going forward, micro retail is going to be the way both our retailers and our property owners can have to trend. And of course, there's a lot of ways to accomplish micro retail. Upper left, I've just described that, which is the use of demising walls. But there are other solutions too. Top right is the introduction of subdivided cubicles within a larger space, kind of the whole pop-up shop, which is akin kind of to the food court methodology we've seen on the bottom right in many places, or just kind of the retail emporium on the bottom left. I just think we need to be asserting ourselves. If we see, as COVID reopens, people are having trouble releasing their space, either in part or in whole, we may need to be taking this message to them and saying, hey guys, not only are you going to have a hard time releasing that space in total, that's not even the way retail's trending right now anyway. Retail is trending towards micro retail, these smaller 350 to 500 to 700 square feet shops. So why don't you go ahead and reconfigure your space in that manner and see if we can help them in that way. Last but not least, here's a couple of just design considerations specific to this COVID crisis. Believe it or not, I would rue the day that I would consider COVID introducing some positives or some advantages, but there are some unique circumstances that we can take advantage of. And specifically from a private property owner perspective, they have probably had less people coming in, out of, and onto and beside our buildings than ever before. And so it's a great time to go ahead and handle deferred maintenance kind of issues. If there have been deferred code compliance issues, this is a great time to do it. And as Joe Lonazak points out, and his paper is also in the PDF, when you do these kind of code compliance adherence renovations individually as opposed to as a part of a larger project, because you're voluntary solving them, there are oftentimes tax credits available to you. And then finally, of course, just fix up your buildings. This is a great time to do it since you have so little traffic. But then I think there are also some things that we can take advantage of the public realm. I hate to say this out loud, but it's the truth, and you probably share it. I love driving right now because there's so little traffic, okay? But so since there's so little traffic, this is the time to test and appeal to your local municipality DOT for the kinds of gestures that we've always wanted to do, but we never could do it because there was just too much traffic. We couldn't shut a street down. But those colorful and creative and artistic crosswalks, I know we recommended some in Maryville. This is a great time to appeal to the municipality to do it, this kind of tactical urbanism, or street intersections. And the only thing I want to say about those two things is if you decide to pursue your municipality or your DOT about these, please, please, please promise me you won't try to sell the project on purely aesthetic beautification reasons, even though that would be a side benefit and byproduct. The real reason we need to pursue these things is because of pedestrian safety and just calming traffic. That's how you sell this to those agencies, but I would strongly encourage you. Number three is if you've considered a road diet, that is the narrowing of a roadway or the introduction of bike lanes, or in this case, we want to toy in Lake City with mid-block crossings and bump outs. So we're taking advantage of this time to put these temporary installations up and see if the public gets accustomed to them and likes them. And if so, we'll go back with permanent installations later, just like this did with bike lanes. So the ultimate road diet is what Tampa is doing. Again, I can't commend them enough for their willingness to try a really big and bold idea to close off. You can see at the upper right, they modified it from the upper left, and you can see they've only closed half of the street off, which I think is a wise thing to do because now they have the best of both worlds. They can maintain a small amount of automobile traffic, but they maximize outdoor seating for the restaurants. I tell you what, I'm just going to fly through this just to remind you, if you have to address with merchants and municipalities a couple of key issues, these are the three. Number one is signage. Signage is one of the most important things right now for us to help them do, whether it's the transactional directional signage or the safety signage. Number two, parking management. You know, again, everybody's competing for this space, and while right now we have the least amount of traffic downtown than we ever have, cars will start coming back and cars are going to want to park. And so I would encourage you in this time, in this spirit of cooperation, two things. Number one is if you already have parking resources, just make sure they're signed very clearly so that people know they can park there safely and securely and not fear being towed. And number two, if by removing on-street parking to introduce parking or pedlets, and you now have to find additional resources to accommodate what you've lost, in this COVID spirit of cooperation that we're sensing and feeling, this is the time to appeal to the churches and the courthouses and the civic buildings and the institutions. If they have additional parking or parking that's going unused, or parking that's only needed in certain times and not in others, this is the time to make the appeal and work out a memorandum of agreement to share those resources. Again, keyword are temporary, temporary, temporary. We aren't asking for this forever, just to get us over the hump. But I would appeal to you, if you're going to do that, please, please, please be a good neighbor. You know, if additional signage is needed, you be the ones that purchase and install it. If they need to do repairs to accommodate parking, help them with those costs. And then again, we've all experienced this. What does the merchant do? They park right in front of their building. We may need to use friendly enforcement like never before to make sure we're deferring the best parking places and the best parking resources to our patrons as they re-enter our downtowns as we reopen. I'm just going to skip this because it's boring. but we just, as we determine which of these temporary gestures become permanent, we may need to address and revise our incentives, guidelines, and our ordinances. So we're done. You've already been aware of these, but I'm just going to reiterate the Reopen Main Street site that Jay Schlensaw created, in my estimation, is probably the best one-stop shop. And of course, I've already given Tampa kudos for their Lift Up Local campaign. That PDF is at your disposal. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Main Street site, which is also a really good repository. And I sincerely apologize. I realize I'm going over time, but I'm done, Keith. I'm going to turn the floor over to you and to the participants. And while I'm absolutely willing to answer any questions, I also really would prefer and welcome your ideas and your insights, what y'all are doing to respond to COVID from a design perspective.
Well, Randy, you mentioned that last slide that it's boring. Well, nothing you present is boring. There's so many great ideas that you presented. I wrote down several of them. And you and I talked yesterday about the Unconference, the 3-day vendor. I really love kind of the interaction at the end, kind of recapping and that sort of thing, since people can't look at these questions. So I do have a comment that I'm going to add to. And so one of our Main Street directors talked about what we've been talking a lot about within our communities, and that's the CARES Act funding that is flowing through the counties into the municipalities. And, you know, I was talking with a different director yesterday who was just, you know, that the county just isn't understanding that they can, you know, some of this money is set aside for small business recovery, and the county just can't put it into their mindset giving money to businesses, because that's small businesses. That's not normally how they operate. And in fact, they kind of shy away from that. But Lindsay made a good point about calling them responsive component grants. I think that was, you know, it is all in the terminology of how we phrase things and how we talk about things. And I think that those are great terms that you mentioned, maybe to get that response, because those things are not inexpensive. To add those shields and the hand sanitizing stations and the additional signage. And so I think that's a great point. And then the other thing I wrote down is those business recovery zones. I think that's definitely something that our Main Street community should be looking at and advocating, you know, being that business recovery zone. So if other folks have questions, feel free to ask those. Yeah, go ahead, Randy.
The one thing I want to say in response to what you just said, and I hope this doesn't come across as arrogant, because it's not my intention. If there's ever a time for Main Street to position themselves to be the expert in this, this is it.
Yeah.
You know, we have so many resources at our disposal, and so my admonition is for that county council that doesn't know how to facilitate this, the Main Street program, let's come alongside. You know, offer to do anything that the county feels uncomfortable with, within reason, of course.
Yep.
But if they don't have the capacity at the county level to write the grant, offer to write it for them. If they don't know how to administer it, you know, offer them coaching and teaching and training. But I mean, you just look at the resources at the Reopen Main Street site, you look at the National Trust site. I mean, all the information is there for us to position ourselves to be the experts, so to speak. And I think kudos to Missouri Main Street. You know, that simple graphic that you have of the 1, 2, 3, 4, that alone conveys we have a plan and we know how to respond to this. And I think to the degree that your local programs can do the same thing, it's not being arrogant, it's being helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And we have had Main Street programs are educating the counties on,
Right.
You know, we are best able and equipped to help you with this. We have a state organization that's helping us understand and dissect this, and we have a national organization that's helping us understand and dissect this, and consultants across the country that are helping us dissect this. And so they are becoming those communication managers and educators of folks that aren't necessarily familiar with how to best help small businesses. And so that's it's been great to hear the stories, and of course we have cities and counties that are leading the way, and those are great examples that can be provided to those counties that maybe aren't understanding as well. The other thing I wrote down, Randy, was the whole parking management, and you know, you very visually and with words described, you know, parking is different than what it used to be. We've got these curbside pickups and drive-throughs, and as things start to reopen, we're going to have to think about, are those permanent? And I know we've had a couple communities talking about permanent signage because they want to keep curbside pickup available to them. And we're currently doing a consumer survey, and I was kind of looking at the results this morning, and overwhelmingly folks want to keep that option, curbside pickup. It's become convenient for them, and it's still a way to support those small businesses that they so much love. And so your point though about thinking about the parking going forward 3 and 4 months down the road, how are we going to address that? And your whole spirit of cooperation. Everybody wants to work together to support those small businesses. So now is the time, whether it's parking or some of those other tough issues, let's test the waters. Let's have those conversations. Let's talk about them. So I think a very great point that you made there, Randy.
You know, it's unfortunate that it took a crisis to both make us be willing to work together. Secondly, to be willing to try these non-traditional creative solutions to problems that Main Street's been advocating for, by the way, for many, many years. It's just the circumstances have created an opportunity where there's a willingness to try them. I fully expect, I could be dead wrong, but just as curbside parking pickup has become not only allowable but preferable, I think once we start introducing these parklets, people go, hey, can we keep these here? And so I think at that point, we're going to have to revisit fairness issues and access issues. Jonathan, who spoke after me last week at the conference, I thought he had a fantastic idea. You know, he talked about that it may be a timing issue, like during these hours, it belongs to the restaurants, and during these other hours, it's available for parking. Or during one day, this side of the street gets parklets and the other side is parking, and the next day they alternate. You know, we may have to explore yet again even additional creative responses, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of these temporary solutions become our preferred approaches going forward.
Do you also see maybe, Randy, that this also precipitating, and I know some of the bigger cities are experimenting with that, permanently closing some streets?
All right, I'm about to step in it.
And the only reason I ask that is that we have a lot of cities toying with it and looking at ways to do it. And so, you know, kind of seeing the bigger cities making it permanent, I'd want to see what your thoughts were.
I would proceed with extraordinary caution. I have now, this is not a brag, it's just a scope. I probably worked in 400 or 500 communities around America in some form of planning.
Yep. I
I can count on one hand the number of successful pedestrian mall streets. It takes some very unique circumstances for that to be a sustainable solution.
Okay.
But I can count on multiple hands those that tried it. It was a miserable failure in the amount of money that was spent. So my personal opinion at this point would be, I would encourage this to only be a temporary solution and not a permanent solution, at least for entire blocks closing down both sides of the road. I think Tampa, again, a pretty wise study. They originally said they're going to close down the entire street, and now apparently they've only closed down part. That's my assumption. So I would be cautious to close down an entire city block and let that be a permanent solution.
So instead, looking at those parklets, looking at alleys, some of those other applications, as opposed to actually the whole street.
That would be my personal professional opinion.
Well, that means a lot. With as many communities that you've worked in and things that you see, you know, those are the things we're looking for, because again, we have communities that are talking about it. So, hey, I know we're way over time. I just have one more question. If anybody else has it. No, you have this great conversation. We're so excited to have it. Anybody else have any questions, please put them in there. I think the other point that folks made just as our last one are those vibrancy amenities. I think that also, you know, brings up the CARES Act dollars that are available. How do we take some of that burden off of business owners? And so I think that was another great example. And of course, I've heard you talk about it many times because you're always an advocate of those vibrancy amenities. Any thoughts on what gets the most bang for the buck as we end this webinar?
Are you asking me or asking the participants?
I'm asking you.
If you've heard me talk about it before, then here it comes again. If I had a gun to my head and people said I could only improve one part of your city, my answer is always going to be the sidewalks. It's always going to be the sidewalks, because everybody experiences the sidewalks, whether you're in a car or you're on the sidewalk itself. You may not enter into a particular business, but you're going to walk beside it on the sidewalk. If we make our sidewalks and our street frontages exciting and interesting and intriguing, they become more of the potential of a magnetic draw and a destination. And again, the amount of money that is spent to animate and activate a sidewalk is infinitely less than is required to fix up the buildings or do streetscape projects. And so I would start with vibrancy amenities that address the sidewalk first, and then go to our parks, green spaces, and open spaces second. And so at the top of my list, just like Pascagoula, Mississippi, if out of my own pocket, I would spend money on colorful bistro tables, chairs, and umbrellas right now, because you're going to solve two problems with one. You're going to help a restaurateur, and you're going to introduce this vibrancy and this color into the environment. After that, it would be vegetation, you know, the shrubs and the landscaping and the flowers. And for those, especially concentrate your efforts at the corners first, mid-block next, and then in front of strategic locations thereafter. Because again, the corners are where traffic is going to stop. And so at those artificial pause points, make sure that the visual appeal is strongest at the corners. And Keith, I know you've got terrific imagery. I think it was from Liberty, Missouri, and the kind of treatments they've done on those corners. That's where I'd concentrate my efforts.
And you're an architect. I don't want to butcher your saying, but you have a saying about the vibrancy versus the building that one will probably. What is that saying, Randy?
Well, number one, I'm a recovering architect. And number two, what I say is experience and environment trump architecture every single time.
Yep.
I hate to admit that out loud, but it's the truth.
Well, lots of comments, Randy, on great content. Our folks really enjoyed this, so we want to thank you for joining us from North Carolina. And
no, South Carolina.
South Carolina.
I always do that to it. I did. We've got a tropical storm heading your way, so we better let you go.
Yeah, it's raining outside right now.
Yeah. Randy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey,
We
sincerely,
really
I love you guys. I've just so enjoyed getting to know Missouri Main Street, and man, you guys are so lucky with Gayla and Keith, and I kind of sort of vicariously met Ben during the unconference, and I know you have others, but kudos off, y'all are obviously one of the shining stars in the nationwide program, and it's an honor to be with you guys today.
Well, thank you, Randy.
You in March and April. So looking forward to rebooking those community visits. So thank you all very much. Just as a reminder, this is recorded, so it will be in our GoToWebinar library. You guys, have the rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.